Summary and Analysis. The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin opens at a tense moment when the terrible news of Bentley Mallard's death is being delivered to his wife Louise Mallard with great care. Mrs. Mallard, as we see, is troubled by a heart disease. Hence, her sister Josephine is very careful while communicating this sad news. Mr. Mallard's friend Richards, who is aware of Mrs. Mallard's heart condition, has taken all the necessary precautions before breaking the news to her. In fact, he had double-checked the information of his friend's death. Mrs. Mallard took in the news in a rather different way. After a sudden weeping, she retired to her room alone and made sure that she was followed by nobody. Then she sank in a comfortable armchair that faced an open window. Mrs. Mallard could sense an extreme exhaustion that had overwhelmed her body and seemed to have permeated her very soul. But then again, something terrible and wonderful seemed to be happening at the same time. While she felt tired, Mrs. Mallard at the same time suddenly became alert to the little details around her, as if so far she had been blind to them. The writer has quite subtly, through the use of different images, presented Louise Mallard's state of mind as she started taking in the delights of things around her. The open square, the treetops with leaves in springtime, the distant cry of a peddler, the faint voice of someone singing far away, the twittering of sparrows, all these simple things made themselves prominent before Louise. A strange change was coming over Mrs. Mallard. As she remained seated in her armchair, the writer draws our attention to how young and beautiful Louise is. But more importantly, her face showed signs of repression, as if she had endured quite a lot of pressure. Yet her personality showed a certain amount of strength, a courage that had enabled her to continue her marriage. It becomes gradually clear to the readers that Louise's marriage was not as happy as the people around her had thought it to be. Now comes the very significant utterance by Louise Mallard. Free, free, free. Mrs. Mallard is fearful of this thought. She had tried to resist this oncoming feeling of happiness, but she failed. It becomes crystal clear that marriage had become a sheer burden to Mrs. Mallard. All these years she had been the perfect wife, the kind that society expects of a woman, and in the process she had compromised her own little needs and desires. She had lived up to the expectations of her society, friends, relatives, and above all her husband Bentley Mallard. The societal pressure had made her oblivious of what it is to be free. At the same time, the readers understand that Mr. Mallard too had never taken into account his wife's wishes. He was not unkind, and Mrs. Mallard knew that she would grieve for her husband. But despite the tragedy, she could not help being happy at the thought of future prospect of freedom. She now hoped for happy days when she would live for herself only. We can find her feelings, or we can trace her feelings in the expression, but she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. Through Louise Mallard, the writer now voices the anguish of the many women who had been victims of a burdensome marriage, where there is a severe absence of love and mutual respect and understanding. On hearing of her husband's death, Louise Mallard can only think of her freedom. The line expresses her feelings. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime, as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. Mrs. Mallard further pondered that she did love her husband sometime, but most of the time she did not feel any love for him. The line that expresses her feelings is, what did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? She again repeated to herself that she was free, body and soul free, as if she did not believe that this was happening to her. Josephine, who had no clue to the innermost thoughts and feelings of her sister, worried that the news of Mr. Mallard's death had terribly impacted her sister, and the self-isolation that she has imposed upon herself will only worsen her health. Louise, on the other hand, did not want anybody to interfere with her newfound freedom. The delightful feelings of freedom had now completely overwhelmed her. Again, the line shows she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. Louise's hopes were running wild. Now she had hopes of a bright future when she would have her own little dreams and wishes fulfilled. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. Finally, Louise came out of her room, and together with her sister she went downstairs. But situation took a drastic turn when someone opened the front door. He was none other but Bentley Mallard. He was very much alive. In fact, he knew nothing about the accident. He was surprised to see Josephine's reaction and Richard's vain attempt to guard Mrs. Mallard. The real blow came down upon Mrs. Mallard, whose thoughts and feelings by now are no longer hidden to the readers. All her hopes of freedom were blown away in an instant when she saw her husband walking in through that door. The shock was so intense that her heart succumbed to the sorrow and shock that she must have felt deep within. The irony that marks the ending of the story is that everyone, including the doctors, interpreted her heart failure to the sheer joy that she must have felt on seeing her husband alive. Now we come to the character sketches. Mrs. Mallard. Now Mrs. Mallard, wife of Mr. Bentley Mallard, is the central character of the story. She is a patient of heart disease. The news of her husband's death in a railroad accident is communicated to her with great care in case her health deteriorates. She, however, receives the news strangely. The readers soon find that Mrs. Mallard is sad and delighted at the same time. It is gradually revealed before the readers that Mrs. Mallard is a victim of bad marriage. All throughout her life she had been controlled by her husband. Now that her husband was dead, she hoped to be free and live life on her own terms. However, all her hopes are destroyed when Bentley Mallard returns home perfectly healthy without even the knowledge that there had been an accident. With her hopes now gone, Mrs. Mallard succumbs to a severe cardiac arrest and dies. Her death is interpreted as due to the sheer joy that she must have felt on seeing her husband alive. The next character is that of Bentley Mallard. The readers come across the character of Bentley Mallard through his wife, Mrs. Mallard, and we have a good understanding of his character when we see his wife craving for freedom and hoping to see better days now that he was dead. We understand that Mr. Mallard is a controlling husband, and there was not much love that should characterize a truly happy marriage. Mrs. Mallard had no say in their married life. Not that Mr. Mallard was an abusive husband, but he had been thoroughly ignorant of his wife's needs. So much so that Mrs. Mallard felt that she was caged in her marriage. Hence, when Mr. Mallard returns, the overwhelming sorrow killed Mrs. Mallard, while everyone took it as something else. The next character is that of Josephine. Josephine is Mrs. Mallard's sister, who is very caring, and being aware of her weak heart, she cautiously presents before the latter the news of her husband's death in the railroad accident. However, as the story progresses, the readers find that Josephine has no clue to her sister's innermost thoughts and feelings. Like others, Josephine too believed that her sister Louise Mallard is very happy in her marriage, and she loves her husband so much that the news of his sudden death will lead to the deterioration of her health. When Louise Mallard succumbs to heart failure, Josephine, like others, believed that her sister had died out of sheer joy on seeing her husband alive. Richards is a good friend of both Mr. Bentley Mallard and Louise Mallard. Richards is well aware of Mrs. Mallard's weak heart, hence he takes necessary steps to prevent any deterioration of Mrs. Mallard's health before delivering the sad news of Bentley Mallard's death. He double checks the information about his friend's death and then only approaches Mrs. Mallard with the news. We come across Richards towards the very end of the story when he tries in vain to guard Mrs. Mallard from suddenly seeing Mr. Mallard alive. Richards is a caring friend who too has no understanding of Mrs. Mallard's pain and troubles in her marriage. Finally, we come across the characters of the doctors. We get just one line about the doctors who were rushed in to check Mrs. Mallard as she collapsed on seeing her husband, Mr. Bentley Mallard, walking in alive through the front door. The doctors reasoned that Mrs. Mallard suffered severe cardiac arrest owing to the joy on seeing her husband alive. Now, it is interesting to note that the doctors too failed to learn what was going on in the heart of Louise Mallard. The doctors can only check and explain the physical reasons, but they have no knowledge of the inner workings of the mind. That's what the writer has tried to show. Therefore, nobody but Louise Mallard and the readers, that is us, know the truth behind her tragic death.